Hello and welcome. My name is Piotr Woycicki and I'll be running the session on Brecht's epic theatre. So the topic of the session will mainly concern Brecht's epic theatre, its tenets, its aspects if you like, and then the legacy and relevance of this type of theatre to contemporary theatre and performance, which will be the main topic of discussion for the session. So in this short mini lecture, basically I would like to just go over the basics of epic theatre and some of the tenets, some of the aspects of Brecht's epic theatre, which we'll then discuss and possibly try to identify within the types of contemporary theatre or contemporary political theatre, to be more specific, because Brecht's theatre is usually political. That you may have seen or experienced or watched. So we'll be looking and discussing case studies in the actual session. Okay, so just to briefly introduce Bertolt Brecht, I'm sure many of you have heard of Brecht, probably if you studied theatre or literature. He's one of the most important and influential figures of 20th century theatre. To say the least, and again without any exaggeration, he's probably one of the most influential figures of modern theatre. In fact, he's so influential that many of his techniques have become almost invisible nowadays, because they've become so common and people have become so used to seeing them, to using them in theatre, so it has become almost, his methodologies have almost become transparent in some ways. He's known as a playwright, poet, screenwriter and director, but also as a theorist, and this is again something that we'll be discussing in the session, and something that I'll be outlining. I'll be outlining some of the theory, and then we'll try to see and identify those theoretical concepts within case studies. So just to briefly go through some of the the most important plays he has written, like Fear and Misery of the Third Reich, Mother Courage and Her Children, The Good Person of Szechwan, Life of Galileo, The Caucasian Chalk Circle, The Irresistible Rise of Arturo Ui, and the very famous musical, The Threepenny Opera. So I'm sure many of you have heard of these plays, and that he has written and perhaps seen some of them, maybe even performed and acted in some of them, or staged them. Anyway, but without further ado, I'll move on to the epic theatre. So again, defining epic theatre does take a while. I'll make my best to just sum it up. Basically, Brecht's concept of epic theatre places an emphasis on the relationship between art and history, revealing the work to be a construct of specific social conditions. So that's quite important. Epic theatre is something which arises out of a specific historical moment. So he's quite interested in the relationship with history, how we perceive reality as a result of our knowledge of history. And in general, he's quite interested in looking at the political reality and the social reality in which we live, and how theatre can directly express that. The epic in the epic theatre refers to the action of telling something about the past, as opposed to a play that shows something about the present, or which relays a singular author's objective idea. So I'll explain this further. It's usually referred to as historicization. Most of Brecht's plays are based on fables. However, those fables, or rather, sometimes they're fables, sometimes they are scenarios from a distant past. However, they are allegorical to the present. So he's trying to tell us something about the present by showing us the past. And the reason for doing that is to create a critical distance. So we are distanced, if you like, from what we are seeing, from the story, from the play that we are seeing, and therefore we can objectively and critically think about it and then relate it to our present. I'll explain this a bit. I'll explain it further soon. The epic theatre is therefore a term that encompasses different staging techniques as well as theatrical and spectatorial modes that allows us to perceive the narrative from a critical point of view. So again, as I said, the critical point of view is actually key here. He doesn't necessarily want, Brecht never didn't want his audiences to be emotionally involved or too much emotionally involved with the action, and that they would simply take the side of the character, of the main character, of the protagonist. And if you go along on this emotional roller coaster, as like sometimes, you know, if you imagine like a Hollywood film, not all Hollywood films are like that, but many are, you know, they take you on a journey, the protagonist takes you on a journey, we take their sides. Brecht never wanted us to take sides. Instead, he wanted the audience to step back and think critically, analyze and judge his characters, his actions. And quite often the characters, including the protagonists in Brecht's plays, are very controversial. So you shouldn't necessarily identify with them. He doesn't want you to identify with them. He wants you to think critically and judge them and analyze the social and political situation, which makes them make the choices they do within the plays and have the dilemmas they do. So it encourages the audience to think critically, and I think that is one of the key main things of epic theatre, to inspire critical, politically invested thinking. So how does he do that? So there are various elements in aesthetics in epic theatre. There are many of them. However, in this mini lecture, we'll go over 4 main ones, and those will form the basis of the discussion in the subsequent session. So Verfremdungseffekt, that's the first one, known as alienation effects or defamiliarization effects. Gestus, historicization and realism. So Verfremdungseffekt, which is German for alienation distancing effect. And basically the Verfremdungseffekt is the most important concept of Brecht's theatre. All subsequent elements reinforce the epic theatre's need to alienate or defamiliarize the audience, contributing towards creating the sensation within the moment of performance. The defamiliarization is made manifest in several ways between the audience and the actor, the actors in the performance, and also between the actors and the characters that they play. So basically the audience is alienated throughout the performance, and that could be done in various ways. For instance, breaking the fourth wall, like addressing the audience directly, so characters address the audience directly. Also the set is quite deconstructed, so it's not naturalistic, it's not trying to create an illusion, it's showing that it is theatre. So the audiences are seeing a process of putting on a play. They're seeing the labor of the actors and the stage crew who are putting on the play. Stagehands sometimes walk on the stage. The transitions are quite explicit. There is no attempt to hide the fact that it is theatre, as sometimes you would in very naturalistic, illusionistic types of theatre. And also the actors and the characters they play are somewhat detached from each other. In other words, the actors don't necessarily embody the characters as they would in a naturalistic or setting or within psychological realism. Instead, they are distanced from it. They demonstrate the character. So this sometimes ends up being, you could think of it like satire or parody. You know, when people parody someone, or when actors parody a specific character or persona, they distance themselves. They're not quite them. They are creating a comment. Yeah, parodies and satires usually create a comment on the character. So an actor comments on the character as opposed to just being them, or trying to be them, trying to be immersed within the character like you would have in the case of naturalistic acting and psychological realism. So again, this is done for the purpose of instilling critical reflection. So the actor in Brecht's theatre must sustain a critical distance between themselves and the character. They do not become or turn into the character. This exposes the work and the labor of the actor, which dramatic theatre strives to conceal. Yeah, so usually in dramatic theatre or naturalistic theatre, the actor pretends to be a character and therefore tries to conceal the fact that they are not. Whilst here in Brecht's theatre, the mode of performance is presentational. They sometimes step out of the character as well, and narration is also being used. They narrate the character, so it's not it's not like a naturalism. However, having said that, there are moments when the actors actually play the characters like they would in a naturalistic play or a psychological realism. So there is this, if you like, this double agency of the actor, one that is at times demonstrative, presentational, and at times naturalistic. Obviously, this has an effect on the audience's ability to feel empathy towards the character or to identify with the character, as I already mentioned. So it's not easy, and because of that detachment, one can have more of a critical perspective and therefore analyze the character's actions and their situation more objectively. Arguably, that's the aim. The effect continuously reminds the audience that they are observing a constructed work, reinforcing a critical distance between the audience and the theatre. So here is a contemporary production of The Drums in the Night from 2017, and as you can see, the set isn't trying to conceal the fact that it's theatre. It's quite deconstructed and it's quite clearly a performance. It's not an illusionistic set. So there's another here instance of another production by the National Theatre of Mother Courage. Again, you have things like placards, labels. It's clearly a constructed performance, and the audience aren't supposed to be immersed in an illusion, in an illusionary set. Instead, they're meant to think and critically analyze the political and social situation which the play deals with. Okay, so that's one aspect, Verfremdungseffekt, and really it's like an umbrella, if you like, effect, because most elements and aspects of Brecht's theatre are alienation effects. They are Verfremdungseffekt, so it's a very big concept. Another pretty interesting concept, in some ways one could say this is the holy grail of a Brechtian actor, is Gestus. And Gestus, the concept of Gestus relates directly to the actor's performance in the epic theatre, and is one way of generating alienation effects. Physical gestures are modes of expression rooted in social reality. As such, a gesture, a character's status and social class can be expressed through gestus. This creates a form of performance of showing rather than doing. In other words, gestus can quite often be a gesture which reinforces, or if you like, emphasizes a character's social reality or social status. If you like, I'll show you some examples of gestus in a minute, but basically it can be, quite often it is a repeated gesture which emphasizes the social circumstances of a character and their social status, if you like, and that can be done through speech, that can be done through physicalization, through props, through the way the character is positioned on stage, through proxemics, through his relationship to other characters. For example, a character who has high social status may be constantly looking down at other characters. It could be positioned higher up, and that becomes, if you like, a bit of a simple indication in this case of the fact that they feel or perceive themselves as superior. Whether they actually are, that's a different question. But basically, gestus reveals a social expression in the actor's performance rather than psychological or facial expression. Yeah, it's meant to say something about how character is positioned within their social milieu. It is also important to note that the significance of gestures varies from one society to the next and from one time period to the next. And therefore we should be suspicious of any universalisms. So it's always historically specific in that case. Here is an example of Gestus from a play Man is Man, and that is basically the stilts soldiers who are, so there are these characters in that play who feel or perceive themselves as superior to everyone else, which they aren't, but they are quite arrogant, and that is what they think of themselves. So using stilts, and again this will affect the physicality of the actor, is a way of indicating status and can become a form of gestus. What's also interesting here is that it's a precarious form of gestus, or rather social superiority, because stilts are unstable and at any point they could lose their social status. So in many ways this gestus, if you like, shows this superiority but also the precarity of their status, because at any point they could fall and lose their status. Here is another interesting gestus in Mother Courage, or rather in the production with Meryl Streep. She had this purse. She had this red purse because Mother Courage, if you know the story, she's profiteering from the war effort, and she's very greedy, and her whole life revolves around her business. And she was always holding on to her purse, or quite often, and closing it and holding it really close to her heart, which again is very symbolic and indicative, because her whole life, her whole existence depends on her business and on the money she makes. So that becomes an indication of the social status, and also of what she values the most in life. I mean, she values the money in her life to such a point that she ends up sacrificing her own children in the end. So again, this can be seen as a form of gestus. Okay, the third aspect that I'd like to talk about is briefly historicization. So historicization alienates the contemporary by locating it in the past. It presents events as being the result of specific historic situations and conditions, and the decisions that were made as a result of those conditions. The difference between the past and the present can emphasize what has changed. The similarities between the past and the present can emphasize what remains the same or is unchanged. So basically what historicization is Brecht's use of, or strategy rather, to write plays about the past, or use fables, which then are an allegory. In other words, they refer to the present. So by looking at the past, looking at past stories, histories, we can think of the present moment. So for instance, Mother Courage, which I briefly talked about, the action takes place in the 17th century. However, the play came out right after the Second World War, and it is about the Second World War, even though the scenario, the setting, is in the 17th century. If you see what I mean. So it's set in a very different period to the actual present on which it is trying to comment and critically analyze. So you could think of, well, why is he doing that? Well, the point is that after the Second World War, as you imagine, the war and the tragedy of it, of the war, of the atomic bomb, of the Holocaust, of Auschwitz, was so impactful, so terrifying, that and the very fact that so many countries, obviously, and so many people and so many families participated in the war one way or another, people couldn't really create any kind of. It wasn't easy to create any kind of critical distance, if you like, to something which was so impactful. Therefore, in order to analyze the war and the situation, the political situation that it created, Brecht decided that the best thing would be simply to tell the story of a war happening in the 17th century, which was quite a while ago, and therefore didn't have that kind of impact when seen in theatre as a play which would potentially be about the war that just has happened. And therefore, by looking at a distant past, one could analyze more critically, with a more objective distance, the present and the war that just happened and that occurred. So historicization is also a distancing effect, is a historical distancing effect, which allows us to create a distance to what we're seeing, as not to get so emotionally involved, and therefore think about it in a more rational, analytic way. It's also about exposing historical narratives as being ones that are predominantly told from the perspective of the ruling classes. This allows for the possibility of alternative narratives, ones that had thereto been discounted or silenced. So quite often history is, well, it's told by the victors, but also it's controlled and if you like, and curated by those who are in power, the ruling classes. So by questioning historical narratives, one can expose alternative points of view. So again, there's that political element here at play. And Brecht is therefore also suggesting that history is always conceived as something that services specific needs, usually the needs of those that govern or are in a position of authority. So again, looking at history not as necessarily something which happened the way it happened because it had to happen, but something which was specifically servicing the needs of particular parts of society or governing bodies in this case. So again, it becomes a critical analysis of history. Yeah, he's not simply trying to say what has happened. He's trying to analyze why these events have taken place and what were the political and social agendas behind those events. Yeah, and as I sort of mentioned, Mother Courage is set in the 17th century, but it's really about the Second World War. Just like the Caucasian Circle, it's an old fable from set in mythical ancient Georgia, but it's actually about the breakdown of Europe after the Second World War, about the division of Europe between the Soviet Union and the West. And finally, realism. With realism, all the previous elements serve to reinforce the idea that this is not a fictive theatre, despite its uses of fictional narratives. This advances and makes more complex the relationship between realism as an aesthetic form and the realism of the social event. We are required to pay attention to the material reality of the event. Brecht demands that we locate ourselves in relation to the theatrical event. This is always a political stance. So again, even though his plays do not aspire to be psychological realism or naturalistic, illusionistic, actually what he's showing in front of us is there are political situations that are grounded in the historical moment, and he elicits us to make those connections between what is seen in the theatrical event and the world outside. So he doesn't want the audience to go into theater, forget about their worries, forget about what's going on outside in the world, enjoy some kind of a piece of entertainment, and then leave and go back to their lives. No, he wants theater to be directly connected to the reality in which the audience live, and he wants to make the audience think politically and about the political situation which surrounds them, affects them, and upon which they potentially have some kind of an impact. So he wants the audience to be politically active and politically engaged. and ideally his theatre, the theatre that he conceived and wanted to, and the ideas he put forward are all strategies to enable that engagement. So in the end of the day, it is about engaging with the political reality outside of the theatre, as opposed to just escapism. Again, he was quite against escapism. He was never against entertainment. His plays are very entertaining, also very funny in a satirical way. There's a lot of dark humor. They're very engaging, but nonetheless, they are designed to address the political and social realities in which the audiences find themselves. Anyway, so these are the four main tenets of Brecht's theatre, and in this session we will look at some examples, and hopefully we'll discuss any examples of political theatre or performance which you have seen or been involved with, and try to identify perhaps some of the legacies or some of the influences of Brecht's theatre in those case studies and examples of theatre that you may have seen, or the ones that we'll be discussing. Okay, thank you, and I shall see you in the session.